This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be interviewing three men who have written on men who came before Charles Darwin and influenced the history of geology and evolutionary biology. As you see on your screen, they are Alasdair Sponsel, Christoph Imscher, and Jack Rebchek, and they will be talking about, respectively, Charles Lyell, Louis Agassiz, and James Hutton, and we will get to it in just a moment. So in this segment, I would like to just have each of the three panelists introduce themselves. As you viewers can see, one of our panelists is here just by audio, and that's Jack Rebchek. So Alasdair Sponsel, if you could take a few minutes, tell some of the viewers who you are, what your interest in geology or history of science is, and a little bit about Charles Lyell. Alasdair?
Hi, thanks for having me, Dan, and nice to you, Christoph. I Nashville, Tennessee. I'm in the history department, but I'm trained as a historian of science in particular. And my special areas of interest are in the history of exploration and the field sciences, including natural history, geology, and various sorts of ocean-related sciences as well, since the late 18th century. And I'm interested in running right up towards the present. Part of my work at the moment is the history of coral reef science. And, the book that I'm just finishing revisions on right now is a book about Darwin and his early career. And one of the central arguments of that book is that Charles Darwin, one of our figures for today's talk, was an even more influential part of Darwin's career than had previously been appreciated. So Darwin, of course, is the well-known protagonist of evolutionary biology born in 1809 and died in 1882. But as it's not quite as well known, Darwin began his scientific career with great enthusiasm for the science of geology.
Hold on, I'm gonna pause right here because okay, if you could please continue.
So Darwin's early ambitions as a man of science were very much in geology in particular, and it's been well known that his ideas, both in geology and in thinking about the history of life, that is evolution, were influenced by Charles Darwin. But they were also, aside from Lyell being an author of great interest to Darwin, they were close personal friends. And I'm sure that's something we'll talk about.
Yeah, I know with Lyell, he came after Hutton. And I know as a boy, one of the things that always sort of interested me in Lyell was when I first read his massive book on geology. I always found science books more interesting than fiction books when I was young. And the idea of the uniformitarianism and the layers of the earth and everything being laid down. And I always, it always struck my mind that he must have had quite a keen eye for detail. It must have been only life, especially a couple of hundred years ago, going out into the field and just being there using what would now, I think, be considered, antique kind of equipment. What drew you to both Darwin and before him Lyell? Are you someone who has gone out on digs yourself?
I've had the great pleasure of visiting some of the spots where both Lyell and Darwin did field work. Most recently, I was at Mount Etna in Sicily, which was an important spot for Lyell in the late 1820s. But as I say, my academic training is primarily as a historian, and what interests me about both Darwin and Lyell is really the interesting way that they blended interest in what you've described as field work, going out into the world, but also in theorizing. They were both prolific authors of of scientific theories. And by author, I mean publishing significant works, and in Lyell's case, many, many editions of significant work. But also, they were responsible for ideas that not only have been attributed to them, but which have really shaped the work of lots of their contemporaries and people down to the present day. So for me, what's fascinating about both of them is the way they blend the experience in the field with an enthusiasm for theorizing, which was not exactly appreciated by some of their contemporaries.
Yeah, and I know one of the things that when I was very young, 6 or 7, 8 years old, when I first started going to the library and reading through both Darwin's major books and also Lyell's, I was like taken aback by just the staggering detail, these long books and just these detailed descriptions of rocks or fossils and whatnot. And for a lot of people, I guess it would be a dry read, but I always found it fascinating that people could describe in such minute detail these little things and then extrapolate upon them. Just a final question at this moment: to what degree do you think that principles of geology influenced Darwin's works?
And I'll just say for folks who aren't familiar with the book, this is a 3-volume work by Lyell published between 1830 and 1833, Principles of Geology, which I'm glad to hear that you find it entertaining because Lyell certainly was writing not just for his fellow geologists, was interested in captivating a kind of learned, broader public. And I can talk more about the kinds of audiences that Lyell was trying to engage. But yes, Charles Darwin read all 3 volumes of Principles as they came out one after the other. What's interesting is that during the world on the British naval ship Beagle from 1831 to 1836, you may notice that overlap there between the publishing years of Principles and Darwin's voyage. So Darwin actually received the second and third volume while he was in South America during that voyage. As the voyage was and then of course for the rest of his career as well.
Okay, well, let me turn to Christoph Imscher now. Christoph is the expert on Louis Agassiz, and I finally, after all these years, got someone who could pronounce. I didn't know it was Agassiz or whatnot, but it's close enough to the tennis player Andre Agassi, I guess. And so he was the latest of the 3 people that we're mainly going to be talking about. I know as a child, I was fascinated. They used to have these little pocket books as a kid, and the story that always fascinated me the most about Agassiz was the story that sometime, I guess in the 1830s or 1840s, he had been studying glaciers, and he predicted, because there had been some mountain climber lost up in the Alps, and he predicted where the body must have fallen into the glacier, and he was able to predict something like 25 or 30 years later that it would come out at a certain valley. And sure enough, it did within a few months of his claimed prediction. And I always thought that was just so cool. And I remember thinking, boy, to be able to live to see that would be to see the physical confirmation of a theory like that he could. Story, or is that? Then tell us a little bit about yourself and the man.
Well, there's many apocryphal stories, and that's one of them. There's some of them do check out. Some of them, that might be different. Agassiz was a great inventor of things about himself, and a great propagandist. He was very good at advertising himself. And one of the things that your pronunciation of Agassiz actually raises the interesting point. Agassiz in French means magpie. Thieving magpie basically was one of the epithets that got attached to him, because one of the really kind of interesting things about his theory of glaciers is that it was actually a collaborative thing. Many people had come up with ideas that Agassiz then took and synthesized and created into or reinvented it in his own theory, essentially. But there were a lot of people who were hurt, offended, because he'd taken their ideas and without appropriate acknowledgement, which becomes sort of like a theme in his career, that he would help himself to observations, specimens collected, made by other people, and then attach them to his name and turn them into essentially a successful campaign for himself and his own importance. He's a very ambivalent figure, and just to answer your question about how I got to how I got interested in him, I'm a professor of English at Indiana University Bloomington. I also direct a scholarship program there. I work a lot with undergrads from different departments, so interdisciplinary work and so forth is something that's always interested me. I'm an immigrant myself. And I've always been in my work kind of drawn to people who came to America and sort of tried to refashion their lives somehow to fit into this new environment. And I started out with a book that is now 20 years old, I guess, Poetics of Natural History. And Agassiz was my final figure, the subject of my final chapter. And what I was interested in this book was looking at a tradition of natural history writing in America from John Bartram, basically, in the 18th century to Agassiz, and their attempts to account for the place of humans in their description of nature and themselves, which inevitably came up, and also the kind of racial question became very dominant. And Agassiz is, and that needs to be said whenever we talk about him, is now associated mostly with a rather noxious form of racial theory, polygenism, the notion that separate creations are responsible for what we see today, speaking in Agassiz's terms. As I was interested in Agassiz, I was also interested in John James Audubon. And Audubon is an abiding interest of mine. I've written about Audubon's plates, about Audubon's nature writing. And then in another book, I became interested in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who is not is an American, of course, but was probably one of the most multilingual writers in 19th century America. We think that he spoke about 9 languages fluently and was able to read a dozen more. And the cosmopolitanism interested me. As I was working on Longfellow, I started inevitably, because I'm an archival scholar. I read manuscripts. I spend a lot of time in libraries. I became very interested in Agassiz, who was one of Longfellow's closest friends. Found a lot of material at Harvard, especially, which is a gold mine for, Agassiz's papers are there. And much of this had not been used in a long time. And I became kind of interested in finding out more about it. And before I knew it, it became another book, a biography of Agassiz. So that's essentially sort of the trajectory of my interest in him.
It sounds like Agassiz was sort of the P.T. Barnum of his time for science, in that he may have been overvalued as a scientist, but his real value may have laid in being a science educator, sort of like a Carl Sagan was 30, 40 years ago, or like Neil deGrasse Tyson is now.
Yeah, he was a great communicator. One of the things I should say is that he started out as a very, very respectable scientist. His work on fossil fish, for instance, which still has not been mined completely. There's lots and lots and lots of drawings at the, I think, in London Geological Society cover. And that time, it was just the pre-American time. He left for the United States in 1846. He was one of Alexander von Humboldt's proteges, and Humboldt tried to encourage him with fossil fish. There's a very funny letter in which Humboldt actually writes to Agassiz and says, if you don't finish your work on fossil fish, if you keep doing this glacial stuff, I'm going to appear in your dreams as one of your neglected fossils, and I will haunt you. Humboldt was discriminating enough to recognize that Agassiz's talent was for close observation. He was a collector. He was somebody who had boundless energy. He worked extremely hard. He was passionate, and Humboldt loved these qualities in him. There's a story about Agassiz, and this is actually one that he that he repeats himself a couple of times, and it's just convincing enough to ring true that when his eyes had kind of given out from too much observing, and he couldn't see anymore, he would take a fossil specimen and actually taste it with his tongue because he wanted to get that close kind of sensory approach. And this kind of passion in Agassiz was a wonderful thing, and it ignited an entire country when he came to the United States. People would collect for him wherever he went. The problem was that Agassiz jumped too fast, too quickly from the evidence to conclusions that he drew, and that he was hampered in a way by a rather rigid ideological framework that constrained what he did. And there were people who recognized that. And Agassiz, I think, at some point himself knew what he was doing, but it was too late for him to stop. There's a tantalizing entry in a journal by one of his students, Henry James Clark, where Agassiz confesses to him that when he writes things, he doesn't even look at specimens anymore, because he essentially had run out of time. He was just producing, organizing, collecting, and it was too late for him to stop. Darwin was smart enough. Darwin and Asa Gray, his colleague at Harvard, were smart enough to recognize what was going on with Agassiz, and they swooped in and basically undermined him, which is one of the glorious stories of 19th century science.
Yeah, I know science history is littered with people who had wacky beliefs. The most famous, of course, being Newton. I'm thinking of Lord Kelvin also had some beliefs that were out there. I know that Alfred Russel Wallace, who also came up with the theory of evolution, sort of went in an odd vein. I know back in the 19th century, spiritualism was big, and I know a few scientists got snookered along with later on people like Arthur Conan Doyle. Did he fall into that kind of category in terms of like falling into this kind of mumbo jumbo?
No. What Agassiz, the best way to understand him is if you think of the people who loved and adored him. He was much admired by very serious people. If you think of the circle of transcendentalists, for instance, Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, what Agassiz presented to them was a way of thinking of nature in spiritual terms, but without organized religion, without any kind of specific religious creed being associated with it. He essentially taught them or reaffirmed their belief that there is a kind of essence, a spiritual essence that resides in nature. But with a very, very interesting twist, nature is meant for us to be legible. We are, in fact, positioned so that we can, if we spend enough time, if we work hard enough, to decipher the secrets of nature. So essentially, the divinity resides in us. It is something that really, it's really the best defense for scientific activity you can think of. Agassiz was of the opinion that if we have enough time, we're old enough in time, we'll get to a point where we can completely understand nature, where we can come to a sense of what God's plan for the world is. And that to me is a profoundly compelling idea. When it's Agassiz sort of rejecting, in a way, he was a minister's son, rejecting Calvinism, rejecting what he'd grown up with, and replacing it with a theory where he is the agent of deciphering the world, reading the book of nature.
All right, thanks, Christoph. Let me turn to our final panelist, Jack Repchek, who has written a book of James Hutton, who actually came. We're talking about. Jack, are you still there?
I sure am. Yep.
Okay. I know the most famous quote that I remember as a kid was something like that: "No evidence of a beginning, and no prospect of a future." And that's one of the great quotes in science from Hutton's work. He was the guy who sort of smashed the Christian idea of 6,000 years of history. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about James Hutton, Jack.
Right. So again, first of all, nice to be with this panel, Dan, and nice to meet both you, Alistair and Christoph. So I'm a book publisher. So unlike Alistair and Christoph, they're academics. I'm a book publisher who often publishes academics. And I was fortunate enough in earlier years, I was the geology editor at Princeton University Press. I now am an editor at Norton Publishing Company in New York City.
But while I was editing geology books at Princeton, I became aware that there was sort of this gap in the literature. I kept reading about James Hutton as the father of geology in all the books I was publishing, but no one ever, there was no available biography, certainly not in layman's terms, available on Hutton. And I asked several of my geology authors, in particular Walter Alvarez, who's the geologist that discovered the extinction of the dinosaurs through the KT extinction, who's been one of my authors over the years, if he would write a book on Hutton. And he said, no, I'm just not interested. And I asked others, and I just couldn't get anyone interested. And then I decided, well, if no one wants to do it, I'll put my money where my mouth is, see if I can, you know, I'm always editing other authors' works. Maybe I should try this game myself and, you know, see what it's all about. So I pursued the book myself and came out, The Man Who Found Time, James Hutton and the Discovery of Earth's Antiquity, came out in 2003. So my interest was prompted by my work on geology books through Princeton. But once I got into the subject, what I discovered was an incredibly interesting jack of all trades academic, or I'm sorry, geologist, who, you know, basically started as a farmer, was just very attentive to what he saw around him, and basically was completely impervious to sort of thinking about the Bible. I mean, what hampered every other natural philosopher before Hutton who thought about the earth was that they truly believed in the book of Genesis and what was then well understood to be a 6,000-year-old earth. And Hutton just simply didn't pay attention to that. And getting back to what the earlier, some of the earlier comments in this conversation about the ability of Lyell to you know, just sort of like trust his eyes, that's what really separates Hutton from the pack as well. These guys were not constrained by popular beliefs, and they just let the facts present themselves, and did great patience.
Jack, can I just ask a question? Because I asked about an apocryphal story about Agassiz, and I know when I went to school, we always heard about 1492 and Columbus discovering that the world was round, but now we know that no one really believed that it was flat. I just want to ask, when Hutton discovered or the idea of deep time, did people really believe that the flat Earth?
I would say that the answer is yes. That most people absolutely believed that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. It was codified, basically. It was so everyone read the King James Bible, right? And you know, in the margins of the Bible, the one that everyone had in their home, it says, you know, Earth was formed in 4004 BC.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, I didn't want to interrupt you, but it just occurred to me that might have been one of those things that we got wrong in history class.
Right. No. So that was, and it's interesting. It's arguable that a few scholars were skeptical of only 6,000 years old, and so they might have in their minds thought, you know, the Earth has to be longer than that. But Hutton was the first to basically say it's impossible to tell how old the Earth is. It's incalculably old. It could be hundreds of millions of years old. It could be billions of years old. But it's certainly nothing close to 6,000 years old. And what's interesting is the beginning of his theory was really simple. He was a farmer. He watched the power of erosion on his farm in the lowlands of Scotland. And he was the first to recognize that erosion really held the key to so much of what you see on the Earth. But erosion is profoundly slow. And there's just no way you can see the formations. The formations that are visible could have formed in such a short amount of time. And that began the theory.
Well, let me just talk about the concept of deep time, because as I've been doing these interviews, I've intermittently interviewed scientists, and one of the things that across, whether we're talking about deep time or we're talking about the concept of nothingness, a universe formed from nothingness. A few weeks ago, I had 4 people debating who had alternatives to the Big Bang cosmology. Human beings seem to always run up against the wall when it comes to things that are beyond the day-to-day ken of human beings. So there's a kind of comfort in believing that there may have been a God or something that started things. The idea that the Earth might have been only a few thousand years old. Do you think what do you think in Hutton himself gave him the ability to say, well, I'm going to follow the evidence, and the evidence shows this isn't 6,000 years old, that this has to be a lot older. was he someone who was, an outsider as a child, someone who thought outside the box, or is he someone just dedicated to meticulousness?
Yeah, I'd say he thought outside the box. I mean, basically, he was a deist at a time in Scotland and especially Edinburgh when where he was raised, where deism was popularly practiced, and so he believed in a creator God, although he never spoke about it or put it down on paper. But essentially, it appears that he believed in a creator God. But other than but God's hand was not visible anywhere else. So he believed in natural laws. He was a devout follower of Newton. He had his professors at Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh. One of the main ones was one of the more best popularizer of Newtonian science. So it was basically Hutton was not a religious man and basically was able to completely ignore the Bible and then allow his eyes to do the rest of the work.
All right, thank you, Jack. Well, let's end this segment. In our next segment, I want to sort of draw the threads of these three men together and how they later influenced people like Darwin. So when we get back, we'll start with Hutton, then go through Lyell, and then Agassiz, and we'll do that in a moment. All right, in this segment, I want to go sort of chronologically and sort of look at where the state of geology was a few hundred years ago and how successively Hutton, Lyell, and then Agassiz had impacts and how they may have impacted each other and then the people who came after them, people like Darwin. So let me start with Jack Repchek this time. Jack, you briefly laid out a little bit of what Hutton was facing, but let's talk about like the British Royal Society and what was was it a conservative time when Hutton came along? I mean, we talked about the 6,000 years, but what was change about to come? Was it sort of inevitable? Was Hutton someone who, if it wasn't Hutton, was someone else, or was Hutton someone who fundamentally did the moment?
That he was pretty fundamentally unique. He's sort of the Elvis of the history of geology, because what he battled was this entrenched belief that you could somehow shoehorn the history of the Earth into the 6,000-year-old time frame. And to be perfectly honest, and this might be something useful for this discussion, Dan, is basically the connecting the dots that leads to Lyell. Basically, Hutton's theory was really in danger of being strangled and sort of dying off with his death in 1797, if not for two of his followers, who basically lead to Lyell. So I thought maybe I'd mention this a little bit. So Hutton basically presents his theory to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and that's really where it took hold in 1785. And then he wrote a long brief that was published under the auspices of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1788 that describes his theory, but especially then the conclusion that the Earth is profoundly old. Basically, there's a lot of criticism of that paper, and Hutton is shocked to find out that people don't believe him, and that the biblical age of the Earth continues to be dominant. And in fact, the publication was probably sort of the official distillation of where thought was at the time was Encyclopedia Britannica, which was in fact Edinburgh, and Hutton was friendly with the general editor of Britannica. But Britannica argued vociferously and aggressively that the Earth was 6,000 years old and that Hutton's theories were kind of crazy. Anyway, so Hutton tries to write a 3-volume work on his theory that basically becomes a big mess. It's way too long, way too technical, and just badly put together. He turns out he was dying of cancer at the time, so that could have been a distraction. So what he benefited from, though, was he had two followers, John Playfair and James Hall, who had witnessed him in the field. They believed his theory quite, they were completely won over. And Playfair then wrote another book after Hutton died, called basically, the observations of Professor Hutton. That was the book that Charles Lyell then read many years later. So it was Hutton's work as interpreted by John Playfair that was Lyell's introduction to Hutton. And then, what's great about Lyell is that he, in the 4th page of his first volume, he mentions that what he's about to present is credited to James Hutton, who was basically the guy who really was the first to figure out how old the Earth was. And again, connecting the dots, as someone I think Alistair mentioned this, but I was having trouble hearing him. Darwin was given the first volume of Lyell's book when he left Plymouth to go to begin the voyage of the Beagle, and he read the first part of the book on his way to the Cape Verde Islands, where he basically saw some evidence on St. Iago, I think is the name of the island, that demonstrated. And again, Alistair, since you're an expert in coral reefs, I believe it was a coral reef that Darwin witnessed that had been uplifted about 30 feet above sea level, that was completely intact, and there was no way that an intact coral reef could fossilize like that, if not for very slow motions on the part of the Earth's dynamism. And anyway,
go ahead, Alice. What are you going to say?
It was it's something very like that, but not a coral reef exactly, but a white sedimentary rock, a layer that was uplifted up into but which was still perfectly level, which suggested that was.
Okay, hold on. Put up again here. Okay, Alistair, if you can continue with what you were saying.
So this is at as Jack said, the island of Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands, the first landfall of the Beagle voyage in early 1832. And Darwin saw not a coral reef exactly, but a white layer of sedimentary rock that had been uplifted in the island, but which had been uplifted and remained level, that is to say, horizontal in the position that it must have been laid. And to Darwin, as Jack said, is a sign of some kind of very gradual, not necessarily meaning just slow, but equable in the sense that it didn't cause a disruption of the level of the bed itself.
And so this was the Cape Verdes. This was done the voyage of the Beagle, and the Cape Verdes are off of Africa, North Africa, correct?
Yeah. So it's their first landfall en route to the coast of Brazil. So they left the south coast of England, tried to go to Tenerife, and were not able to land there. And so the Beagle, as a passenger on that ship, made their first landfall in the Cape Verde Islands.
All right, Jack, if you can continue.
Yeah, well, so my point was that what's interesting is that the connecting of the dots from Hutton to Darwin is very direct. It's Hutton, Playfair, Lyell, and then Darwin, and it's quite interesting. And just to get back to, since the overall conversation here is about Darwin and the influence of these three great scholars on him, it might be worth mentioning that the dominant, in addition to biblical chronology and most geologists believing, trying to shoehorn their theories into the quite young Earth, the way they did that was through what had become in the early 19th century was an area, sort of a type of interpretation called catastrophism, which Agassiz is part of that tradition as well. And Agassiz was influenced by Georges Cuvier, who is a great French scientist. And basically, after Hutton had passed away, and during the time that Playfair was keeping his memory alive, Cuvier, not that he was anti-Hutton, but he was studying the geology around Paris, and theorized that basically there had been a series of floods, great floods, and maybe as many as 6. And the last one was about 5,000 years ago, and that became interpreted as Noah's flood.
Yeah.
So basically, Darwin was taught geology first at University of Edinburgh, which again was where Hutton lived, but he was taught by an anti-Huttonian by the name of Jameson, and then he transferred to Cambridge, and he was taught by another geologist there, Sedgwick. But these guys all believed in a catastrophe, in a universal flood, and that's how they were able to explain the unusual geologic formations all over the Earth through basically the flood happening, the water going away through one form or another. There's a lot of theories as to where the water went. And again, that's what Darwin was taught. So when he got to St. Iago and the Cape Verde Islands and saw this intact strata that Alistair was just talking about. Clearly, a catastrophe had not happened, but basically this had been a coral, or had been a sediment that had been gently raised up with exactly the gentle erosion and compacting and then uplifting that Hutton had theorized. So it was sort of that realization that there wasn't a catastrophe. So it wasn't the way he'd been taught, but it was these other processes that he'd now just been reading about through Lyell's book. And what's so exciting is that Darwin claims in his autobiography that that moment on St. Iago basically made him realize that there was a chance the Earth was profoundly old, and now changing his mindset to believe that the Earth, there was millions of years with which to work. As he then became aware of the changing of species on the rest of his voyage of the Beagle, he was basically saying this makes sense if you have eons of time to do this in, not just 6,000 years old, not just 6,000 years. So it's a very important moment for Darwin and the beginning of his theory.
Okay. Before I turn to Alistair, let me just ask a couple of questions. You'd mentioned that Hutton was the first guy to really lay out that millions of years probably went by. Did Hutton himself have in mind was it 100 million, 200 million? Did he have any idea that what's now accepted as about 4.5 billion years since the Earth formed?
Basically, he actually was quite aggressive in not being painted into a corner. He basically said, "I do not know how old the Earth is, but it's profoundly old. I can't even begin to calculate." Yeah. So he sort of left it to others to come up with a specific age.
And I know I had mentioned later, Lord Kelvin came later, but I know even as late as the late 19th century, there were people who thought that the Earth had formed sort of as a cooling star, and rather than we got more sort of planetary theory. So I know they knew about the solar system back when Hutton was there. Did he have any idea? Did he have any idea of what we think? What happened, that clumps of matter came together and the Earth slowly formed, or was that something that wasn't his concern?
It's funny. I think it would not be his concern, but you're asking very good question, actually. And the guy who I believe is credited, and maybe Christoph and Alistair can help me here, who's credited with sort of the idea of where the Earth formed, and it's actually shockingly close to accurate, is Buffon, another great French scientist, who I believe did most of his work in the 1750s. And basically he theorized that the Earth was formed by a comet hitting the sun, knocking off a big chunk of the sun. That formed the Earth, and then basically the Earth was slowly cooling. So Buffon was a big believer.
75,000 years ago, I think.
Pardon me?
Buffon put a number on it. It was 75,000 years or something like that.
Correct, exactly. He was the first to break out of a 6,000-year-old Earth. In his estimate was 75,000 years, but Hutton did not take on that issue in any way. However, and this is really important, so Hutton's three great contributions. Number one, obviously giving, basically saying the Earth is much, much older than 6,000 years old. Number two, recognizing the power of erosion and pointing that out. But number three was he was the first to recognize subterranean heat, that basically the Earth was hot underneath, and that much of the granite we see on the face of the Earth is injected into already formed strata. Again, all the other scholars with this belief in this universal ocean, or basically Noah's flood, basically water was the cause of everything, and Hutton was arguing that there was heat from within the Earth that both created. Injected granite into stratus, into already existing sedimentary rock, but also was probably the engine to uplifting, which is basically right.
All right. Well, we'll return to some of that in a bit. I'll have some questions, but let me turn to Alistair then. And so let's pick up the threads. Jack had said there had been some Hutton disciples. Did they meet Lyell, and how did Lyell himself get into geology, and what influence did Hutton have on Lyell?
Well, yeah, let me say a few words about where Lyell came from. Like Hutton, he was also from Scotland, and he was born in the last years of the 18th century. So, it's certainly from a later generation than Hutton. His father was a very enthusiastic botanist and naturalist, generally interested in geology as well, in not far from where Dundee is in Scotland. And Charles Lyell Sr. And Charles Lyell Jr. both were trained in law. So Lyell the Younger, our main topic here, studied law and studied geology there with an eminent geologist called William Buckland. Then went to London actually and began practicing law. This is Lyell. But he, in the 20s, made a series of field trips, which were theological work, but they were also.
You're breaking up, Alistair. Hold on. Okay, go ahead. Continue, Alistair.
So Lyell in the 1820s was practicing law, but also taking a series of geological field trips to continental Europe that were, as I said, serious geology, serious work, but also in the fashion of a trip to see classical sites and that sort of thing. Lyell was a man of means, and he was interested in geology not as a mere hobby, but as a side initially to his career in law. But his eyesight began to fail him, and so he gradually gave up the law because he had trouble dealing with the paperwork, and began to commit himself full time to being a geologist, which is to say, to being the author of books on geology, as well as various articles in the periodicals like the Quarterly Review. So by the late 1820s, Lyell had started to turn his attention full time to geology.
Yeah, now he's most associated with gradualism and uniformitarianism, the ideas that went against sort of the biblical catastrophism. You know, the Bible had all of these plagues and, you know, the mythical beings, you know, causing catastrophes. But yet now we know that it's a little bit of both. You know, you can get meteors that come and wipe out whole genera and if not kingdoms. And we also know that by and large, though, you know, things do accrue. So obviously, gradualism came out of Hutton's idea of deep time. What effect do you think that the idea of gradualism as propounded by Lyell had through the rest of the 19th century in other fields, perhaps?
It was considerable, but I feel like it's worth saying a little bit about the richness of the overall discourse in the science of geology in the early 19th century. So although Lyell himself, in that first volume of the Principles of Geology in 1830, cited Hutton enthusiastically, several of us have already mentioned geologists from France, geologists and paleontologists like Georges Cuvier or Buffon. And I think it's worth noting that Lyell, more than Hutton, also was influenced by the work of these continental geologists from France. And part of what's special about it that let me do a test.
Their influence, direct influence on Lyell. You have a second?
Go ahead, Jack.
So it's just very interesting. So I mentioned there's John Playfair and another guy named James Hall, who were his young, basically people who joined him on his field work and became firm believers. James Hall, who was actually he was in his early 60s. Lyell sought him out in Edinburgh and befriended him. This is in 1824, and Hall actually took him in a boat to go see Sicker Point, which is the famous unconformity that Hutton discovered that proved for him, that he wrote about extensively, that the Earth is profoundly old. So basically, James Hall, you know, one of Hutton's two main disciples, took Lyell by the hand basically and showed him this great rock formation that James Hutton, that was really the key to his work. And just to finish that thought, ticker point, it's an unconformity, which means two very different forms of strata. They basically are on top of each other, but they clearly could not have been laid down at the same time. And so for Hutton, it proved that, again, there's just no way this type of stratigraphy could have happened in one fell swoop, like a universal ocean, indicated. But I think it's interesting that Lyell actually did meet with one of Hutton's main disciples.
Okay, Alistair, if you could just finish up on your thoughts on Lyell.
And thanks for that, Jed. I wanted to say that Lyell was a brilliant restoration. I mean, he adapted his skills from his training in the law to his work as a geological author, and so he did a very nice job of advocating for that Scottish tradition back to Hutton. And I suppose it's worth just mentioning a little bit what this idea of gradualism was that we've talked about. It's more than merely an argument about the depth of Earth history, and the term itself, gradualism, is several that were coined to refer to similar phenomena. So uniformitarianism in the early 1830s was coined in opposition to this other term that we've used, catastrophism. Uniformitarianism being the side that Lyell and retrospectively you would say Hutton as well has formed. But the argument that Lyell advocated in Principles of Geology was that both an argument about the nature of the history of the Earth and, equally important, an argument about how to practice geology. And the claim was, from the practicing geology side, the claim was that the kinds of geological processes one sees in action on the Earth today are the kind that you should use to explain past geological activity. And furthermore, the book is meant to demonstrate that the kinds of geological processes in action today and the intensities we keep in action today are sufficient to explain what we see as the history of the Earth through the study of geology. So as I say, it's about practicing geology by reasoning from what you see around you in the natural world to the past. And then you figure Lyell was not unique in arguing that. There was among specialist geologists in Britain that was absolutely interested.
All right.
What was?
All right. Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit again, Alistair. So can you just finish up in a sentence or two?
And what was distinct about Lyell was the argument that present-day causes that we see in effect, so erosion as we see it now, was indeed adequate to explain what geological here.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. So let me turn to Agassiz again and Christoph Irmscher. I know as a kid, I most associated Agassiz with the glaciers, but let's talk about how he got into geology. And was he, since he came on the continent as opposed to these two Scotsmen, was he influenced in any way by the works that preceded him?
Absolutely. He was a student of Cuvier's. He worked with him in Paris. That's also when he met Alexander von Humboldt. So he came out of this this continental natural history tradition. He was probably, which is kind of interesting to think about, he was probably the most cosmopolitan of all these scientists in terms of his training. This is a guy who started out in Switzerland. Actually, he was a mountain. He was of mountain folk origin essentially. He came from rather a humble background, but he was driven essentially to expand. He started out in Zurich, studied in Heidelberg, Munich. And had to promise his family he would become a medical doctor, which didn't work out. I mean, he did get his MD, but he never laid hands on a patient. He also got a doctorate in natural history and ended up in Paris working with Cuvier directly. he ended up in, partially to sort of appease his family, he ended up back in Switzerland again in Neuchâtel at a rather provincial, it was essentially a preparatory school. Sometimes it's referred to as a college, but it was essentially, he was working with adolescents when he was there, and very quickly began to develop interest in glaciers and spend more time up in the mountains than with his family, which is something that Humboldt called him on. He said, you know, just be a father to your family, not to the people you're hanging out with in the mountains. Where he became very fused many things that he had heard from mountaineers, from people who knew the landscape intimately, became interested in the movement of glaciers. And one of the crucial things for him was to explain the kind of striations that he would observe on rocks. He was especially interested in boulders and how they traveled. And there's sort of an interesting connection with Lyell. We talked several times about how Darwin took Lyell's book along, works along on the Beagle, and in an appendix to the Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin actually makes fun of Agassiz and writes about, you know, he'd observed, I think, off the coast of South America, he'd observed fragments, ice fragments, which had broken off glaciers, as he felt, and he emphasized that that this was really that Lyell, who thought that water essentially, or rocks that are carried by icebergs, are responsible for these striations. And he reaffirms that in the Voyage of the Beagle. And he makes fun of Agassiz. He says, you know, how absurd is this imagined period of excessive refrigeration that Agassiz seems to be advocating. What happens, and this is a rather extraordinary thing, that Agassiz, taking these different theories that he's, different observations that he's encountered, he fuses them into this elegant theory of the Ice Age. Ice Age is actually not even his term. It's something that he's taken from an unfortunate college classmate of his, Schimper, who was completely eliminated from Agassiz's theory. Agassiz doesn't even mention him in his book when he finally publishes about it. He takes that and basically exports it to England. And there's a crucial crucial date in 1840. Agassiz speaks at the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and explains what he's been working on. And one of his converts, actually, a rather surprising moment, becomes William Buckland, who is the main, essentially, or the most kind of popular proponent of catastrophism, and arguing about basically Noah's flood being responsible for what we see today. And Buckland talks to Lyell and reports back to Agassiz in sort of a moment that is an epiphany for Agassiz. He said, Charles Lyell believes your theory in toto. I think that is the quote. Little problematic and an oversimplification, but essentially this is where sort of the different kind of strands meet, I think. And Agassiz becomes, in a sense, a uniformitarianism with sort of modifications, but fuses, sort of modifies the theory to suit his own needs. So in Agassiz's view, essentially, the world is ancient. There's no doubt about that. He accepts that. Probably in a response to Hutton, he says at one point, we know that it's one unbroken thread that goes from the beginning to the end. We know the end. Why we don't need to worry about the beginning if we can't figure out when it all started. That's what he says in one of his essays. But the Ice Age, essentially sort of a vast ice sheet covering the northern hemisphere, explains for Agassiz what he really needs to believe in, separate creations. Because if everything gets wiped out, if all life on Earth gets wiped out by an ice sheet, that really explains why God, so to speak, needs to start all over again and create things anew. So rather than sort of arguing for a totally unbroken thread, in reality, he says there's this rupture, which essentially allows me to continue to believe in the discontinuity of species. And that becomes sort of the dividing point between him and Darwin. And Darwin does something very fantastic when The Origin of Species comes out. He actually quotes Agassiz in favor of his own work. And he essentially says, and this is a rather brilliant moment, he says that once pervasive glacial climate can in fact explain why Arctic species can be found in different parts of the world, because they've migrated across tracts of land that have since become too warm to sustain them. Bingo. So what you've done is actually a favor. With Agassiz, we have his copy of Origin of Species, which Darwin, in one of those wonderful moments in the history of natural history, sends to him as a complimentary copy, and Agassiz marks it all up. It's in Cambridge. He's furious, but Darwin is always one step ahead of him, and he essentially says, even the parallelism theory that Agassiz also is associated with, where sort of embryological the history of the species and also the history of natural history of the Earth as a whole.
Ontology recapitulates phylogeny, that kind of thing.
Exactly, and he basically says that would be beautiful too, and I can use it for my theory as well, if it weren't, as he says, just a dream at this point. So he inserts that final moment there, and so that's something that's just you can't make these things up. How Darwin from England is sort of orchestrating Agassiz's demise in Cambridge using Agassiz's own work to his benefit.
Well, were they sort of rivals in the way that Marsh and Cooper in America, the famous bone wars that came a few decades later between, what was it, O.C. Marsh and...
Edward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were they rivals? Were they sort of friendly rivals?
They started out actually not as rivals.
Frenemies, as we would say in the modern... Were they frenemies?
Well, frenemies, maybe. Agassiz was directly responsible in many ways, for Darwin's barnacle work, because he had, in fact, mentioned investigation of barnacles as one of the great desiderata in natural history. And Darwin, spends years and years and years dissecting barnacles, putting an enormous amount of work into that. And Agassiz provides him with information, with specimens. One of the interesting things is the conversation between these two men never entirely stops, because Darwin, which is an indication of his genius, I think, realizes that Agassiz is useful to him as a storehouse of facts, which is precisely, as I said earlier, what Agassiz was great at. Precisely observed, careful facts of natural history. And Darwin writes to him and says, hey, can you tell me something about that? And at a later point, when things have become very complicated between the two, he'll ask Asa Gray to go to Darwin and to Agassiz and ask him. And when that doesn't work out anymore, he writes to Alexander, Agassiz's son, and says, well, can you help me with that? So the communication between these two never quite stops. And Darwin does respect Agassiz, not for his theories, not for the racial stuff that Agassiz spouts, but as sort of a natural history investigator.
Yeah. Let me ask you, let me end this segment with a question to you, Christoph, and then we'll go into the next segment on all three men. It seems to me, as a child, I remember, and some of the things you're stating seem to back that up, that since Agassiz was more involved with the Ice Age and glaciers and that whole idea coming to the fore, that there was this time when the Earth was in a deep freeze, or most of Europe at least, it seems to me that Agassiz, more so than Hutton or Lyell, was responsible for the idea of making fossils come alive. It wasn't dinosaurs, but the idea of woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats and mastodons and whatnot.
Yes.
I always associate that with Agassiz. And also the fact that glaciers, despite being slow by human standards, still within a lifetime you could see movement, unlike the rocks. So to what degree do you think that Agassiz was more successful as in propounding his views and getting sort of a science celebrity? Do you think it had to do with the fact that some of his stuff, his ideas, were provable within his lifetime, and that the Ice Age itself, whereas uniformitarianism and deep time are interesting concepts, they're not the spectacular things? I'm thinking of painters like Frederick Edwin Church or or Albert Bierstadt, who had these grand, the
Yeah,
Cathedral of
yeah.
God. And to me, Agassiz falls more into that his ideas were more big. They were out there. They were more on the edge. They were more sexy, as we would say. To what degree do you think that was so?
They were, and one of the things, one has, you mentioned this early on. Agassiz was a great educator. He was, at a time when Darwin essentially stayed at home and let other people fight his battles for him publicly. Agassiz lectured all over the United States. His lectures were tremendous, tremendous occasions. People were enthralled with him. He was the guy who would bring specimens with him. He would bring fossils into the classroom. He would take his students outside. To catch, as he called it, to catch nature in the act, to surprise it, in the sense that he had little. He could only do this a couple of times. Agassiz was ambidextrous, so what he would do, he would be at the blackboard and let's say draw a fin of a fossil fish, which is something that he knew a lot about. And then he would say, so what do we do from here? And then he would kind of slowly reconstruct the entire specimens. At some point, he would draw with his right hand, and at some point the left hand came out, and he would draw with both hands, at which point people basically fainted in the audience because they'd never seen anything like that. One interesting fact that I forgot to mention earlier, Lyell and Agassiz. Agassiz came to the United States in 1846 as a Lowell lecturer. Lyell had preceded him, and Lyell facilitated the contact actually that helped Agassiz get to the United States, which then became the sort of the beginning of Agassiz's great career over there. Alexander von Humboldt was the one who came up with the money and everything else, but Lyell was directly responsible for Agassiz's success story there. He stayed at the house of Lowell, who was the sponsor for these lectures. So there's that connection as well. But as an educator, coming back to what I said earlier, Agassiz was tremendously effective. What he formed in Cambridge in his great Museum of Comparative Zoology was in fact the first sort of bona fide graduate school in the sciences in the United States. He assembled students around himself, brilliant people for the most part, and his influence in American science is absolutely tremendous, even among people who later renounced him or didn't agree with some of the assumptions of his work. They had still been trained as naturalists, as field naturalists, by Agassiz personally, who modeled the kind of investigation that he felt was important for him. So that is the kind of the abiding influence that he has on American science. In fact, a couple of years ago, a book came out, Oxford University Press book, Agassiz's Heirs, and that was essentially sort of current field workers tracing their influence back through their teachers all the way back to Agassiz. Agassiz's racial theories are not mentioned in the book, as far as I can recall. But that is essentially the unbroken line that goes from Agassiz to some of the work that's being done today.
Okay, well, thanks, Christoph. Let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk about the legacy of the men scientifically, as well as critical reaction and how their lives and their careers have been viewed over the last couple of centuries, and we will explore that in our next segment. All right, this is going to be our final sort of big segment before I give each of the men a chance to give their final statements. But I want to talk for the next 20, 30 minutes or however long it goes about each of the three men under discussion, their influence both in science and out culturally, and also how critical reaction to them waxed and waned over the last 100, 200 years. I wanted to pick up and start with Jack Repchak and talk about something that he had mentioned in our last segment, and that had to do with James Hutton being the first person to talk about or to seriously take the idea that the Earth was heated below. And it seems to me that maybe not a direct line, but over the 150 or so years, that this would have had some influence on Alfred Wegener's later theory of continental drift. Was that something that got sidetracked? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think you're right, Dan. Hutton, I think his legacy is actually quite robust. Since over the last 200 years, and he's in a good place. And it's not so much Wegener's theory of continental drift, because if I remember correctly, Wegener was a geographer, and he noted that this remarkable fit between South America and Africa, but didn't have an engine for what could have possibly broken up that landmass like that. But it was then the theory of plate tectonics, which of course proved Wegener correct. And the theory of plate tectonics, which is only 50 years old, really, was sort of begun in the 1950s and basically nailed down in the 1960s and early 1970s. But basically, plate tectonics is all about subterranean heat and heat driving the plates. And so there's no question that the reigning theory of geology, plate tectonics, which is essentially as important as the theory of evolution in the life sciences, owes a debt to Hutton and his great insight in subterranean heat.
Well, let me ask you. I know in popular culture, think of the Victorian era. I think of H.G. Wells, and is it the Wells or Verne story, Journey to the Center of the Earth? In the 19th century, did people actually think that there was a hollow Earth, that it was honeycombed, or is that just a misconception? Did Hutton and did he have an idea that there was a heated core of the Earth, possibly?
So, as far as based on all my reading, Hutton didn't think much about what was underneath the Earth, what was if there was a core, and certainly had no sense of all the various parts that now we now know make up the Earth. However, what is really interesting about the Neptunists, or the people that believe, the geologists that believed in sort of the watery Earth, again, all these things we've been talking about, the Great Deluge, universal ocean, all that. One of the theories that was quite popular and kept coming back up when people said, okay, what happened to all this water? Did it just evaporate? And a lot of people, and basically these biblical, biblical geologists would basically say, no, there must be big caverns within the Earth in which a lot of the water, went to as well. So you had this sort of picture of, kind of a honeycombed Earth, which it had become, where a lot of the water from the Great Deluge went, in addition to it evaporating away. But I would say that the early geologists were kind of punted on the issue of what's underneath the surface of the Earth, and again, that's a very modern construct.
Did Hutton have any idea of the Earth being heated below and volcanism? He kind of didn't take a stance there. The reigning theory of volcanoes was that they were very much just right under the surface. So there was no sense of a hot mantle being drawn up from deep within. It was basically maybe coal deposits, maybe petroleum deposits, something that was not too far below the surface was somehow ignited. And so there was not a good understanding of why volcanoes happened. And Hutton basically went along with those, but he didn't really talk a lot about volcanoes and what their sources were and what they, how they mattered. Again, that really is a plate tectonics, discovery of the importance of volcanism. Now, I've talked a bit about Hutton and his scientific influence, but the idea of deep time, since it did displace this sort of Bishop Usherian view, did Hutton have any influence in sort of the philosophical thought that came after, that people maybe outside of the sciences were saying, well, okay, wait, if the Earth is not 6,000 years old, if it's millions or tens or hundreds of millions of years old, what else in the Bible may be wrong? Did the idea of deep time, was it something that was, pivotal in outside of just, the small area of geology? Did it have any philosophical impact on European philosophers?
That's a good question, and I would say it's sort of beyond my, my reading. Okay. I would say effectively, no. But this is important. I mean, again, we have to give full credit to Lyell for really, gaining broad acceptance for an ancient Earth. That's really Lyell's great contribution. I mean, he certainly, because again, Hutton's theory was in danger of falling to the wayside if it was not for his successors, and Lyell's tremendous success. I mean, the Principles of Geology went through 11 editions during his lifetime alone. It's just a remarkably successful, one of the great successful science books of the 19th century, probably more successful than Origin of Species in terms of sales. Because it turns out Origin of Species didn't actually sell that many copies. But I would say this: my understanding of a lot of sort of fundamental Christian belief right now is acknowledge an ancient Earth, and all the arguments are over sort of when humans came along. So even biblical fundamentalists sort of accept that now, and it's basically sort of like maybe humans came along 6,000 years ago, and I think a lot of the that's where that argument resides these days.
Okay, how about Alistair? Let's talk about Lyell, and did he have any influence, his ideas of gradualism or uniformitarian, whatever you want to call it? Did this have any effect on, say, people who were doing racial theorizing, or people who were, was evolution itself, the Darwinian or Wallacean ideas, was that somehow sort of a spiritual godson of uniformitarianism?
These ideas were all bound up, and Lyell wrote extensively about species. Can you keep it? Lyell wrote extensively about species, and he did this in Principles of Geology in 1831. So while Darwin was just a 22-year-old heading off on the Beagle voyage, Lyell was, I think it's important to say, a very devout Christian, and it's easy in retrospect to take for granted that there's some kind of intrinsic conflict between science, serious science, and Christian belief. And really, the contrary is true for many of these folks. As Christoph described for Agassiz, an enthusiasm for reading the book of nature, assuming that it's authored by the creator, whatever you call that creator, was a huge motivation for a lot of the work in geology and natural history in the late 18th and early 19th century. And Lyell was no exception. And although Lyell believed in the great antiquity of the Earth itself, he had great difficulty envisioning humans as particularly antique. That is, he thought human history was quite a bit briefer. And when Darwin's theory of evolution became known to Lyell, first in private because Darwin was his young protege, and then of course when Darwin went public in the late 1850s with this theory, Lyell had great difficulty in offering anything more than a lukewarm endorsement for the implication, which was merely implicit initially in Darwin's work, but for the implication that humans somehow belonged in this system without some separate spark of divine intervention that was the history of humankind.
Yeah. Okay. Christoph, let's talk about. You had mentioned a couple of times the racial theorizing of Agassiz. You said that that's sort of been overlooked. I'm wondering, was that something that was in his lifetime, or that was overlooked, or did he have any influence, for example, on the eugenics movement? Some of the people and the people of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the puzzles about Agassiz is, I mentioned he comes to the United States in 1846. There's really no real interest in race or anthropology before he leaves for the United States. And it's not that European naturalists were not thinking about that. There's just no, Humboldt writes about it extensively and in ways that, Agassiz would then come to reject. But Agassiz's interest in race really develops when he's in the United States, and it's part of his attempt to make himself relevant to the American discussion. Having a view on race is something that positions you in that field where you matter, where you have influence. And it's combined with that is what is probably some kind of visceral reaction to racial difference that he's just not used to, and a desire to reaffirm, in a sense, the Caucasian sort of bond that unites him, the immigrant, to all these American scientists that he works with. So there are these various things. He has the rather unfortunate distinction of, in a sense, pioneering, at least in the American context, the use of the camera for the documentation of what he believed was racial inferiority. So these terrible photographs that he commissioned, they were made in South Carolina in 1850, that he was hoped to use as evidence for biological differences between the races that would also help him make the case that these were not just incidental or not just aesthetic, as Darwin later argues, but that they were in fact specific differences, as if they were different species. And that's not the only time he does that in his life. When he goes to Brazil in 1865, 1866, he engages in a far more extensive project. At this time, he monitors himself, of having photographs taken, especially of people that he thought of as racially mixed, again, with the purpose of documenting that there were indeed very real biological differences. And we have those photographs. They are at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, and they are the ones that people have become very interested in recent years, essentially as a sort of documentation of the noxiousness of racial thinking in 19th century America. That said, there's not a lot of evidence that Agassiz used these photographs, except for one or two occasions, in his public appearances. Whereas racial theorizing becomes most relevant, at least politically speaking, is in 1863, when he's actually approached by the Freedmen's inquiry, and he's asked officially, and this comes, from the Lincoln government, Lincoln administration. He's asked to weigh in on what to do with all those freed slaves. What are we going to do with them? What does the future of America look like? And there he comes out essentially as sort of the anticipator, the guy who anticipates in many ways Jim Crow. He's arguing for a segregated America. And he does that very, very prominently in letters that he sends to the Freedmen's Committee, where he argues in sort of ludicrous scientific ways, ludicrous from a scientific point of view, that we need to remove essentially those tempting Black women from impressionable young white men. And that's sort of the browning of America that essentially happens when we just did this cohabitation as possible. Now, these are not original ideas. You find Lincoln, when he's on the campaign trail, you find him saying things like that. Just because I want to free the Black woman doesn't mean I want to marry her. That's one of those unfortunate statements. But Agassiz has this authority of a Harvard scientist that he puts behind those statements. And in the report that the Freedmen's Inquiry then submits is absolutely influenced by Agassiz's thinking. He has a successor at Harvard, Nathaniel Southgate Shaler, who essentially becomes a proponent of some of a version of eugenics. So that influence continues and continues and continues. So in that sense, since you asked about influence comprehensively, this is a completely noxious influence. He survives also as a sort of cautionary tale on how not to do science in some ways. What I mentioned earlier, the way he jumps to conclusions. We mentioned the ice sheets before. He suddenly goes from arguing that the northern hemisphere was covered with ice to extending it to the south. And people say, wait a minute, we don't even have the evidence. There's no evidence of drift. But that's how Agassiz's mind functions. When he goes to Brazil, he suddenly sees glaciation everywhere. And one of his students companions there, Charles Frederick Hart, who is a geologist, says, wait a minute, this is just the influence of weathering, really. I mean, you are not thinking precisely. Cautionary tale, I would say, as an educator, his influence lives on, as somebody who sort of models a way of doing science in the classroom and outside the classroom. Popular science, one of the greatest things that Agassiz said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, he said everyone is essentially a scientist. Science is part of the fabric of society. If you're not a scientist, it's because you're not a scientist yet.
Okay.
And it spawns this great popular movement for science, essentially. The Agassiz clubs emerge and so forth.
I want to talk about the critical reaction to all the men's works to wrap up this segment. But before I do, a couple of points that you made, Christoph, I wanted to just clarify. Did you say that Agassiz had thought that the classical races, I guess in that day and age, it would have been Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, and possibly Australoid. When I was growing up, those were like considered. Did you say that he thought that they were so? How could he explain then interbreeding? Because even a couple of hundred years before, Linnaeus had, I thought codified what constituted, a species as just being able to breed within.
Yeah, that's sort of the great puzzle of racial miscegenation. Essentially, they got around this problem by saying they produce offspring, but the offspring is essentially infertile and it's weak. It won't survive. Now, why? And some of the contemporaries even pointed out that the interesting thing is that some of these were not at all people would think of as enlightened thinkers in terms of race. John Bachman is an example, a Southern naturalist who was he was a good enough naturalist. He did a lot of crossing of species in his own backyard. He said that's absolute nonsense. And why, if indeed that's sort of the response to it, why if the offspring of these unions, these biologically impossible unions, is so weak and infertile, why even worry about it? If you just think sort of in logical terms, it makes no sense. But that's sort of part of an American tradition of thinking about race, where sort of good sense breaks down. You find it in Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia and so forth, where sort of something just collapses. Yeah. And you start thinking in ways that make no sense at all anymore.
Let me just a final point about the Ice Age, because you had mentioned Agassiz claiming that the ice sheet, the moraines or whatnot, would have extended farther than they actually did. Now, Agassiz, as far as I know, in the history books, was only really concerned with the last 10 to 15 million years, the ice ages of the Cenozoic. And in the, I think, mid to late 90s, what has become known as the snowball Earth theory, that about 650 million years ago, that the Earth might have been in toto, except for maybe a thin strip around the equator, have been iceball. There's a book by Gabrielle Walker called I think it's called Iceball Earth or something like that. So what was everything that he was seeing supposedly of Ice Age remnants, or what, was that all just bunkum, or has any of that been in the last 20 years say, Agassiz might have been onto something there? And
yeah, it's certainly been extended, and I mean there are books about Agassiz's influence that really document that the germ of his idea, what he synthesized into his Ice Age theory, is viable. As I said, he just went too far, and you would see evidence where there was none. The Brazil trip is a good example of that. Okay. So that is part of his legacy that survives. If you read John Imbre's book on Ice Ages, Agassiz is one of the founding figures in that kind of thinking. But people build on it, people extend it, people take the theory, come up with the notion that there were several ice ages, for example, which wasn't originally, Agassiz's thinking at all when he started out. So that is the core of that. If we think of it not as Agassiz's theory, but as a theory that he developed in collaboration with many others, Schimper I mentioned before, Charpentier is another one who needs to get credit. One of Agassiz's students, Carl Vogt, was involved in that type of thinking. If you think of this as a sort of collaborative exercise, yes, and one of Agassiz's tragedies, or the tragedy of Agassiz in a sense, was that he was a genius at forging these collaborative work. But then in moves that maybe are still familiar today, would claim it all as his own. He had a great, it was great controversy that he started in his own museum, where essentially he would take things that his students had produced and would sell them as his own. And when they criticized him for it, he would say, you work in my museum, you are using my property, you are using my laboratory, what you do in my museum is mine.
Okay. Let me then let's talk a little bit about the critical reactions. Let me go back to Jack. Since Hutton was the first of this trio to appear, scientific reaction, there had to have been, I would think, a church reaction.
Yes, so there was, and basically the critics were pretty vocal, and he had very few supporters. So basically, the key publication that got Hutton, that created the controversy was his 1788 publication, which was sort of about a 100-page brief published by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And that was when you talk about what of Hutton's works propagated, that was the one that really got into popular circulation. And the criticism was immediate and vocal, coming from both the clerical side and the scientific side. Again, basically biblical geologists quickly rallied around the biblical idea again and declared Hutton's work crazy. And really, it was the key to Hutton's work continuing was John Playfair and that book that was published in 1803, which was the one that Lyell later read. If Playfair had not come to the aid of his now deceased predecessor, Hutton's theories would probably have died off. So the critical response was aggressive. It was quite anti, and it really depended on his disciple to win the day.
Okay, Alistair, how about Lyell? Since he came a little bit later, was the ground sort of softened by what Hutton did?
Yeah, I think probably what's most interesting about the critical reaction to Lyell's work is how fierce it was within the British geological community. So the larger body of British geologists at the time, the serious geologists, although most of them were enthusiastic Christians, they shared Lyell's belief in much of what mattered about geological fieldwork and in the deep age of the Earth, if not maybe as deep. But Lyell's propensity for grand theorizing and his prolific authorship of very, very popular books that sold a lot of copies, and books that he indeed wrote in order to sell a lot of copies. This kind of theory-oriented approach was something that really irked a lot of his fellow geologists. And he didn't really have any disciples until a young man came back from a 5-year voyage around the world. This, of course, is Charles Darwin. And working in my research, I argue that it's not simply that Darwin read Lyell's work during the voyage, but that Lyell, in the years immediately after the voyage, really coached Darwin in private how to be a proper exponent of Lyell's views and how to use the evidence that Darwin had gathered during the Beagle voyage as a way not only to establish Darwin as a credible naturalist and indeed theorist, but also to show how valuable Lyell's approach could be if you traveled around the world applying it. It was actually Darwin, not just Darwin's species theory a couple of decades later, but the young Darwin coming back and showing how valuable it could be to go to places like South America and Australia with Lyell's book in hand. This was really the first evidence that Lyell had accomplished a practical guide to doing geology as opposed to just an interesting narrative in his book. So I would say the popular reaction to Lyell was huge. He was a great public intellectual. He stored a lot of books. And those ideas of deep time and gradual change and insignificance of human history certainly did have effects in the world of visual art, and literature. That's certainly the case. But what's curious is how vigorous the skepticism was of his among his closest friends in geology. And Darwin's influence back on Lyell really was in offering a test case for someone who'd actually tried to do geology the way Lyell advocated in places Lyell himself had never visited, and could offer the arguments that Lyell's approach had for considerable proof.
Okay, Christoph, since we did talk with you a bit more criticisms during his lifetime, let me just move a little bit further out and let's talk about the the last 100 or so years. How has sort of artists and scientists always sometimes have their reputations wax and wane. Where is the state of scientific opinion or cultural opinion on Agassiz here in the 21st century?
Well, he's essentially considered a windbag by most, and that seems to be the abiding kind of interpretation. I would say that if you find respect for him, and I have found respect for Agassiz, it's among people who essentially work in invertebrate biology, who love the quality of his descriptions. First one to really offer a detailed description of a jellyfish's nervous system. Really, that's Agassiz. The quality of his detail work is something that scientists appreciate as a model for that type of investigation. Then, in a more sort of institutional history point of view, I think it's probably safe to say that Agassiz was in love with being a scientist. He just loved scientific work. And that is something that I think still remains impressive about him. He, in one of his most beautiful sentences, and he was a great writer as well, well, maybe not Hutton, but certainly Lyell. He was a great stylist. And in one of the images from his work that I really love, he says, "The world is like the geologist's puzzle box. You stand before it with all the pieces disconnected, and you work and work and work till a coherent picture emerges from your work." If he lived by this statement, if he'd been patient enough to actually do that kind of work, and if the racial stuff hadn't happened, maybe we would be talking differently about Agassiz. But that is part of the abiding part of, I think, his legacy as well.
Okay. Jack, where does Hutton stand now in the 21st century, critically and culturally?
Yeah, no, I think again, I think he's really survived beautifully. Modern geology. Lyell wrote the first great textbook. Certainly, plate tectonics. He doesn't. Plate tectonics is now a big part of the field, but Lyell didn't disagree with. I mean, plate tectonics only sort of gave a dynamic engine to what Lyell observed. So no, the field of Hutton is now thought of as the father of geology. There wasn't even a field called geology really when Hutton was doing his work. So he's emerged as I mean, he would be very happy if he descended in 2015 to see how strong his legacy is.
Okay, and Alistair, how about Lyell? What's his standing now in the 21st century?
I think Lyell, particularly in the English-speaking world, and it's important again to emphasize that this is a polyglot community back in the 18th and 19th century, and science increasingly has become monoglot as it's practiced now. But and historians of the earth and the life sciences today, I think typical part of that is for his influence on Darwin and the way in which people take Darwin's theory of the natural change of order from one generation to the, but just the Lyell's arguments about the gradual change
Okay.
You're
You're breaking up again. Hold on 1 second. All right, continue, Alistair.
So the idea that Darwin's vastly influential work on the history of life was essentially the application of Lyell's graduate ideas from the study of Earth history to the study of the history of life. That's of course where Lyell's great reputation lies today. It's not entirely, but I think it's worth noting that there was a period when Darwin was just the young protege, and Lyell was the guy who was seen not only as having authored the Principles of Geology, but in a considerable sense to have authored Darwin's scientific career as well. So Lyell was the giant in the early to mid 19th century. In retrospect, that he looked most important for what he did with Darwin.
Okay. Well, let me end this segment, and in our final segment, we'll just have closing remarks by the three men, and we'll do that in a moment. All right. I think it's been a productive show, and I'd like to wrap it up by giving each of the men a chance, a minute or two, just to say whatever they want to say, or if you have a website or a book about your subject, here's a time, and I will link to all three men's websites or their books below this video. So, Jack, let's start with you and give you a couple of minutes here. Say anything you want to say about Hutton.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dan. Again, thanks for putting me on this panel. It's been a lot of fun. Real quick, so my name is Jack Repchak. The book in which I describe Hutton's work that came out in 2003. It's called The Man Who Found Time, James Hutton and the Discovery of the Earth's Antiquity. It's available on Amazon easily or anywhere else. I just wanted to give a couple things. Dan, you had mentioned earlier you were trying to find the precise quote that Hutton's famous for, and I thought I'd give it to our listeners. The quote itself is, "We find no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end." So that was basically essentially the bumper sticker motto for the ancient Earth. So that's the famous quote. I think what the legacy of Hutton is, you had a profoundly original thinker. I mean, I mentioned earlier, trying to be, maybe I was trying to be too witty, but I think of him as sort of the Elvis of early geology thinkers. He came out of nowhere. He was an amateur scholar. He did have a medical degree. He not only did he get his bachelor's at University of Edinburgh, but then he got an MD. It would be now called an MD in Europe. So he was a doctor of medicine, but he never practiced medicine. But he was a great observer of nature, and he took that to an extent that most people could only dream of. He was also an amateur chemist, and getting back to the issue of subterranean heat. It was his work in chemistry that allowed him to start thinking about that. And again, that sort of came out of nowhere at a time when chemistry was really in its infancy. And again, I think his legacy lives on through where the field of geology is right now. I'd like to mention one last sort of final thing, a couple things just to sort of connect the dots. Alistair's mentioned this, the important connection that Lyell and Darwin had as friends. And they were. I don't know if it's come up yet in this discussion because I couldn't quite make out everything that Alistair was saying, but Lyell and Darwin were really incredibly good friends. And when Wallace sent the paper that basically had the theory of evolution in it, he sent it to Darwin because Darwin was known to be, the keeper of sort of this theory through a couple of papers he had written up privately and circulated. Basically, Wallace wrote the paper, sent it to Darwin, and said, "Would you please show this to Professor to Charles Lyell at the Linnean Society, so he could, publish it." And it was Lyell who was sort of aghast that Darwin had been trumped, knowing that Darwin had come up with this theory, 15 years earlier. And it was Lyell then, along with a guy named Hooker, who basically allowed for the joint presentation of the papers, the famous. The fact that Darwin's paper and Lyell's and Russell's paper were presented together at the Linnean Society, that gave them both first credit for evolution, but that was a huge move on Lyell's part. And the final thing I want to just mention is We talked a little bit about catastrophism as one of the sort of mindsets of geology that Hutton and Lyell had to confront. So it's interesting. Gradualism or uniformitarianism has sort of ruled the day in geology ever since Lyell and Hutton. But one of my authors, who I mentioned, Walter Alvarez, who came up with the KT extinction theory that an asteroid or comet hit the Earth 65 million years ago, and thus that created the mass extinction that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. That is now basically agreed to by almost everybody. So in a way, we've now gotten a catastrophism back into geological thinking, not so much from floods or the Great Deluge, but from these visits from extraterrestrial visitors, in this case, a comet or an asteroid, that has led to what is now, believed to be at least 6 mass extinctions in the history of the Earth over time. So geology is a very healthy mix now of a lot of the ideas that were circulating 200 years ago.
Yeah, and it's interesting because actually the Permian Triassic extinction is even larger, supposedly, and that's thought to be from volcanism, which also could tie back to the idea of the heat under the Earth that you could, link maybe sideways to Hutton. But Alistair, any final thought on Charles Lyell?
Sure. Since it's come up a couple of times, including just now with you, I'll mention that Lyell and Darwin both were fascinated by the makeup of the interior of the Earth, and they both thought that volcanism and earthquakes were linked through some kind of hot fluid substance under the crust. And Lyell, although he did not have an idea like the idea that now goes by the name of plate tectonics, he was equally interested in the movements of discrete areas of the Earth's crust. It's just that Lyell believed that these movements were vertical. They were up and down movements that were possible for the changes in whether above or below the surface of the ocean. And so there are great similarities between certain elements of Lyell's work and the idea of plate tectonics, where for Lyell it's about vertical and up and down movements. In plate tectonics, it's about these horizontal movements and collisions of plates. And I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that Lyell anticipated plate tectonics, but that in both cases, ideas of areas of the Earth's crust having particular geological histories of their own was an important one. If I could, rather than just closing by mentioning Lyell alone, just point out the fact that all three of the folks we were speaking about had trainings in science and careers in science that, with the exception of Agassiz, would look very unconventional today, but which were not at all unconventional at the time. And I think Christoph's right in emphasizing just what a spectacular institution builder Agassiz was, and that's really something that made him unusual in science in that period, in managing to systematize scientific training, create procedures and structures for doing so using Harvard. But it's so easy looking back at past science and past scientists to compare which of their ideas still seem to hold water today and which ones seem antiquated. And I just want to use the fact that Hutton and Lyell both came into science as an enthusiasm rather than initially as a career to make money, to make the broader point, if I could, that so much of the social world of studying nature, so much of the kinds of audiences that existed for reading scientific books like Lyell, this was a different and much more open kind of scientific world than this world we have today. So, along with these other figures, is the way that their properties, their social environment, that are
Okay.
played in not as a contaminant to their scientific careers, but really as a crucial constituent in their study.
All right. Thank you. Christoph, final thoughts about Louis Agassiz?
I just want to offer two different images. One of them is a little more familiar. During the earthquake in Stanford, it was 1906, I think. Agassiz's statue on the Stanford campus fell off and ended up head in the ground. It was quite a spectacular sight. The image got reproduced a number of times, and a Stanford student is supposed to have quit. And that's something that David Starr Jordan reports, that Agassiz was great in the abstract, but not in the concrete. And I want to turn this around and basically say he is, in fact, great in the concrete, not in the abstract. These are some of the things that still abide about him, this enthusiasm for looking, for the absolute passion for scientific inquiry he had. You know, this is the guy who would plunge into the water with his microscope because he couldn't get the jellyfish out of the water since they wouldn't survive. So he went to them rather than getting them out. This is sort of a fantastic image. His seaside laboratory that he had in Hutton was a pioneering kind of thing. So the other image I want to offer is something, and I know Jack can't see it, but it's something I really like. It's a little ruler. I don't know if I hold it up if people can see it.
Yeah.
It is from the Spencer Microscopic Company's Lens Company in Buffalo, New York, and it says on it, "Study nature, not books." Louis Agassiz. Not something that I want to show necessarily my students, because obviously I expect them to study books, but that sort of is sort of the opposite image of Agassiz, you know, somebody who wants to get us to the thing itself. And that's something that, for instance, a poet like Ezra Pound in 20th century America, that's what he loved. Pound, you know, has his own problems, which I can't go into, but at any rate, this is sort of the abiding kind of thing that probably should be associated with him as well. And I just want to say it's been great fun, and thanks for having me on the panel.
Well, I want to thank all three of you, Alistair, Christoph, and Jack, and anyone who wants to find out more about either of the three men before you or the men that they have written about. You can look underneath this video and you will see links that you can click to their books or their websites or their colleges. And if you enjoyed this weekend, yesterday I did a show on Ray Kurzweil. So if you enjoyed this weekend of science, next weekend it will be film. I'll be talking on successive days about the careers of Woody Allen and Michelangelo Antonioni. So we'll go from science to the art. And again, I want to thank Alistair, Christoph, and Jack. It's been an enlightening and good discussion.
Thanks for having us, Stan, and I really enjoyed talking with everyone as well. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.